Okay, welcome back to the course. Now I have 8 data objects in my S3 bucket. These were sent over by my ESP8266 through API Gateway, processed and filtered and enhanced with Lambda with that date now stamp, which gives it these names in sequential order, and then dispatched over to this S3 bucket that we made earlier in lecture 1 of this 4-part series. So in this lecture, we're going to create another bucket where we're going to host our static website. It's going to directly extract these data objects from this S3 bucket, and then I'm going to graph it in HighCharts, and I'm going to show you what that code looks like. Now, I will say before we get started, having one public bucket hosting the S3 website, normally what you would want to do in a more professional application is use Route 53 with CloudFront to lock that bucket down on the front end. So just using an S3 bucket without buying a DNS and using the default static IP we're given through the unique name of the S3 bucket, we don't have that options on the web host side. Now, this bucket here with our data is currently private. Optimally, I want to keep this data private, but I'm not going to do that in this example because I'm going to extract the data directly bucket to bucket. Normally, again, in a more professional application and in my course, Serverless Design for IoT Data, I show you how to use a Lambda to ingest and consume data so you can keep your data bucket private. You would simply call Lambda from your web host, and Lambda, which is private, can extract your data and then bring it back to your web host. I'm going to be lazy in this example, and I'm going to keep these buckets public, but I will show you a really quick and easy way to do pretty good security on a public bucket, although it locks it down by IP address, and that can still be spoofed, but I'll show you that anyways. Okay, let's move on. So here's my bucket, and I have 8 data objects set over by the ESP and Arduino to this bucket. So the first thing we're going to need is to get our base address for our bucket, and surprisingly that isn't that easy to get, but I'm going to show you how to get it. If I just click one of these data objects, it'll come up with this screen. This is my base address. You see where it says object URL? You're going to want to copy your object URL up into the point that it says AmazonAWS.com. And I'll show you how far that is. But you're going to need that object URL because to get data from our data bucket, we need that base bucket name to extract it from that nested structure. And I'm going to show you that next. Anyways, let's go ahead right now and create our web host in S3. And again, as cost-wise, this is basically free. So again, if we don't have a paid DNS where we're using Route 53 and CloudFront, we're not doing edge optimized websites or anything. This is extremely cheap. For the static web host I'm going to show you, it's going to be less than a penny a day. It's pretty ridiculously cheap, which is nice. Okay, so I'm going to come back out here to Amazon S3 and I'm going to create a new bucket. So we just got to think of a bucket name. I'll just call it something that I know globally unique. I'll call it NNN78. And I'm going to switch the region back where we've kept everything consistent. I'm just going to go ahead and create this bucket. And since this is going to be the place for our static web host, I'm going to put it in here in a second. I'm going to open this bucket up, and I'm going to drop my static web host in here. I'm going to use properties to make it know it's the index.html that's our landing page, and then I'm going to set this all for public permissions. So let me show you what my code looks like real quick over here. So there's 3 parts of this code. I didn't do 3 separate files for the index.html, the app JavaScript, and the chart formatting, which is normally the way you want to do it. But I just put the HTML up here, and the only library we're calling in here, the only CDN, is HighCharts. So we have HighCharts up here. I'm not calling an Ajax. I have my XML and JavaScript formatting for HighCharts down here. I'm not going to talk about that. The only part I want to talk about is a complicated part, and it's this part. And you can go over this, but basically here's my global bucket name I'm using. And then below that, I have my individual file name. This is where we kept our data files. So you're familiar with that. That's where I have my 8 data objects. So you'll need your global bucket name where you have your data objects, and then you'll need that folder where those data objects are held. And we created those in lecture 1. So if you forgot how we did that, go back to the first video and check that out again. But these are simply the names I used in that first video to hold our data objects. So what it's going to do, it's going to go into the base bucket. Look through the base bucket for what data partitions are in there. It's going to find this IoT data folder, which we know ahead of time. And then it's going to extract all the data objects from that data folder. And then it knows they're called humidity, uptime, and temperature. And it's going to extract those out and put it into HighCharts. So one thing worth noting, since we're not bringing in the Ajax CDN, the get that we're using for a request on this web page is explicit. So instead of having that $.get, we're doing a full get command, which is not a big deal. All it is an XML HTTP request, the old style where XML used to be around. And it's like 5 lines of code instead of 1 line of code. Just realize that's what you have to do if you're not using that abbreviated version the Ajax library provides you. So I'm going to give you this code. But what we have to do now is move this code into our bucket. So I've already saved this code and I'm going to move it into our bucket. So how I'm going to do that is it's open this folder over here. I've renamed this index.html. So that code you just saw, I'm moving it over here and uploading it to this new bucket I just created. And then the next thing we have to do is make this bucket public. So if the first thing I'm going to do is hit this tab properties. And I'm going to let it know that we're using this bucket for a static web host. So I'm going to click this, use this bucket for a static web host, and say index.html. And many of you have already done this before, so this will be nothing new. And save that. Now it knows that I'm hosting a static web host in this bucket, and my landing page is called index.html. Next thing down the line, I'm going to go to permissions here. And I'm going to stop all blocking of access. So I'm going to turn everything off. And save that and confirm that I'm indeed making this a public bucket. So if you have this as a public bucket, again, it's only good for prototyping. Don't ever put anything in here that you don't mind people seeing, because people can use Black Hat software to troll various open IPs and grab data off various open buckets. That's been a problem with Amazon before, and they really are aware of that at this point. Next thing I'm going to go is right down the line here to access control list. I have to make one change here. I'm going to hit public access everyone and allow anybody to list objects here. That means they can read my bucket information. That's not a big deal. Writing objects would be more dangerous if they do a cross-injection attack, but listing the objects not too important, so go ahead and save that. Next thing, go right there to bucket policies, and I'm going to put a public bucket policy in here. So I have that on my GitHub repository for the course. I'm going to say public bucket read policy, and I'm just going to copy this. And I have to make one change on this, so I'll put this in here and simply paste this in here. And then the only thing it requires is the bucket name of the bucket I'm in, so I'm just going to copy this, copy, and paste this right in here, and you'll do the same thing for your bucket name. Obviously don't use mine, and save it, and if that's formatted correctly, it'll now say public and say, hey, your bucket has public access. Next thing, I can go to the course configuration, and I'll go right up here, and I'm going to look at my public course configuration, and I can just copy and paste this. This allows a cross-origin read. So I want that. Depending how they're trying to fetch data from my bucket, save that, and I don't have to customize that. So that's pretty cool. Now I want to show you one other thing. If I want to add some security on this, I can do that with my bucket policy. The easiest way to do it, although it's not super secure, people can still spoof your IP, is I would use my limit IP bucket policy. So what that does, it looks just like the previous policy I posted, except you put in this IP address source IP. You Google for your IP, a simple Google search, type in my IP, your IP will come up. And by limiting your IP here, that means most people outside your organization or outside your house, if they're not directly in your house or in your local area, are going to have a different IP, then they can't access your bucket. So that's pretty cool. So I just wanted to show you that. I can provide you a link to this if you care about it. But it's just a really quick and easy way to add some additional protection. Let's come back here, everything's saved, so we're good to go with this. So we have a public web page here. So I can simply click this on, and my public web page will be displayed, but it's not going to work. You're going to see, I'll show you anyways why it's not going to work. It's going to do the HTML formatting here, but it's not going to bring up the chart because my other bucket where I kept my data still is private. So I have to do the same thing with my other bucket. So I'm just going to duplicate this. And with my S3 console, go back to that other bucket which is this globally unique bucket. And now I got to make this whole bucket public, just like I did with the last thing. The only thing I don't want to do is I don't want to set this for a static web host. I want to keep this as a data bucket. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing I just did to make this bucket public, and I'll come right back. Okay, I just took a few minutes and did the same thing and made this bucket public. So you can see in my data bucket here, which we created in video 1, I have the course policy here, a bucket policy where I changed the name internally to the same name over here, and I kept everyone in my public access with the ability to list objects, i.e. read objects. The only difference is, of course, I don't have this set up as a static web host. So before, as you remember, we had this screen, it couldn't read from our web host, this NNN78 bucket, that's our static web host bucket. It couldn't read the information because that was a private bucket. And again, normally in a production level design, I would have our static web host call Lambda. Lambda would ingest the data from our private bucket and dispatch it through an API gateway endpoint back to our static web host. But I'm keeping it easy. I'm just going directly from public bucket to public bucket right here. So let's refresh this, and hopefully if I've done everything right, now that I've made this a public bucket, it can read that data and our HighCharts will come out. So I'm just going to refresh this page. Good, perfect. So it came right out. I actually added a bar chart here you can check out, although this is just cumulative data, so it's not all that helpful. But again, the 3 values we had were humidity, temperature, and then on the bottom here is simply uptime. So just to show you what those data objects look like if you forgot with those 3 variables in there, I'm going to come back to my data bucket over here, and I'll go ahead and pull it up so I can look at the folders and the data objects in here. It's called Global Data Bucket, and here's our data objects. And you'll see these 8 data objects, they all have the same thing. I'll show you a different way to look at them. But if I click one of these data objects, I can go over here to select from. Rather than downloading them and then opening your editor, this is an alternate way of doing it. And I can just say file format JSON, and I can get a preview. And you can see it's got the humidity, temperature, and uptime. And all the data objects look like that. If I look at another data object, again, I can simply click here, select from. I know this is JSON format, so I can click JSON and then get that file preview. And again, I have a different object. And then all of these are sketched on this graph. Now, if you have more objects, you'll obviously get more data points. So it depends on how long you ran your ESP. But hopefully this was interesting for you and you've learned a lot. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I'll do the best to answer those. And again, I'll have this written up on the web. And if you get confused on these videos, then you can simply refer to the documentation I'll have publicly listed as a technical blog post. Okay, thanks a lot. Go ahead and comment and give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Talk to you soon.